Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 18th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige. The title being A Second Ground Consists in the Imperfect Knowledge of Circumstances. The text follows. But there is still another cause which may stop action in war, viz. An incomplete view of the situation. Each commander can only fully know his own position. That of his opponent can only be known to him by reports which are uncertain. He may, therefore, form a wrong judgment with respect to it upon data of this description, and, in consequence of that error, he may suppose that the power of taking the initiative rests with his adversary when it lies really with himself. This want of perfect insight might certainly just as often occasion an ultimately action as untimely inaction, and hence it would in itself no more contribute to delay than to accelerate action in war. Still, it must always be regarded as one of the natural causes which may bring action in war to a standstill without involving a contradiction. But if we reflect how much more we are inclined and induced to estimate the power of our opponents too high than too low, because it lies in human nature to do so, we shall admit that our imperfect insight into facts in general must contribute very much to delay action in war and to modify the application of the principles pending our conduct. The possibility of a standstill brings into the action of war a new modification inasmuch as it dilutes that action with the element of time, checks the influence or sense of danger in its course, and increases the means of reinstating a lost balance of force. The greater the tension of feelings from which the war springs, the greater therefore the energy with which it's carried on, so much the shorter will be the periods of inaction. On the other hand, the weaker principle of warlike activity, the longer will be these periods. For powerful motives increase the force of the will, and this, as we know, is always a factor in the product of force. So, as you understand from the very first phrase of the paragraph, as well from its title, von Clausewitz here is offering a second reason in order to explain the suspension of action in war, or simply its delay. And this is not less important actually. Von Clausewitz now abandons the ground of polarity that he had used in order to explain in fact, through the differences existing between attack and defense, the reasons why, in fact, the action can be suspended, and looks at this cause, that is the imperfect knowledge of circumstances that we already hinted to in the previous paragraph during the explanation. So here, the definition he gives is this incomplete view of the situation. So the incomplete view of the situation here is presented just like, as if each commander actually fully knew his own position, right, and his own condition. But this is also an approximation that von Clausewitz is using because he proceeds very gradually, so that he doesn't confuse the reader more than much. But naturally, we can comment on what is the incompleteness of the view of the situation in reality. I mean, how complete is our view of reality? Do we really know what's our current condition, situation? We basically don't even know if reality exists. So, and it's all a pretty big mystery that we can't even have some sort of perception and awareness of ourselves in this world. So here von Clausewitz is simply assuming that, of course, every commander knows way better what's happening, hopefully at least in his own army, rather than the one of his own opponent. And says that in fact the opponent situation can be only known to him by reports which are uncertain. Now we will see von Clausewitz will develop actually this concept in the Vom Krige, when he deals with the concept of fog of war and all the problems that derive from here. So all that matters now is to understand that these reports are by definition uncertain. They can even be contradictory, so they can offer a actually pretty difficult situation to puzzle, because it's incomplete by definition. So this commander, as von Clausewitz says, can form a judgment with respect to it upon data of the description, and in consequence of this error, he may suppose that the power of taking initiative rests with his adversary when it lies really with himself. So here it brings even further evolution of the concept, because not only the commander can obviously have a kind of a blurred view of the situation, an incomplete known of the situation, but in consequence of this error that, as we have just said, exists by default, he may even not just make a wrong assessment, but fundamentally reverse even the his initiative, for instance, thinking that at that point this belongs really to his adversary. This is important because if you think that your adversary is kind of stronger and has the power to attack you, as well as you're trying to do, but even better because you suppose in fact he's stronger than you, well, that means that you will at least stop and say, okay, what the hell do I do now? Let's maybe pass on the defensive and let this guy attack. While this might not be true, because you might have made a wrong assessment. So this is particularly important because the concept of defense and of attack, and relatively or better, the concept of initiative relatively to what concerns eventually the action to be taken, so either defending or attacking, is basically what all the dialectics of war is about. So here von Clausewitz is giving us actually a pretty realistic idea of how things can get crazy, because the situation maybe is very favorable for you, but you don't realize it, because you actually don't know. You may even expect it, of course, but you may form a wrong judgment, or you simply might not realize that. You might not know. You may say, I don't have enough awareness of the situation to take an action in here, and you're kind of frozen, because every move you make could be, kind of lethal potentially in that situation. So what von Clausewitz here, however, brings into consideration is another concept that is relatively dialectical and is a criticism that he expects to be to receive, in this sense, saying, it may as well happen that this kind of misunderstanding, the way we have just explained it by right now, could be very, very relative, meaning, how does this really explain the fact that the action of war is suspended? Because if you really think, for instance, that you are the stronger one, you should attack, well, this may even make you going on with a higher momentum, and even with a greater difficulty to understand that maybe you're not in the most favorable condition, and therefore going on with the attack. So this doesn't really explain by itself the imperfect, at least necessarily, or the suspension of the act of war. Well, he answers to this pretty cleverly, saying that it's possible. You may not just be kind of timid and not attacking because you don't know what it's out there, but you should even make even a more hasty attack that at that point, given the conditions, would not be really the best thing to do. But first of all, this still, the imperfect knowledge of circumstances can still be regarded as at least one of the natural causes which may bring action in war to a standstill, without involving contradiction. So it's still an option, so that's still given the aims that we have given us to in this paragraph to explain how what that can be the case. So he doesn't say, you know, in perfect knowledge of circumstances slows war down every time. It can go in both senses, but still it can't go towards that sense. So this is just already naturally, as he puts it, one of the causes of the suspension of action in war without involving contradiction, because it's like it's not based on boldness. I mean, it's being bold in action is not always the right thing to do. Certain attacks can be even madness if you don't have an accurate understanding of the situation. You can't really think it's a wise choice to go out there and just try the risk, unless you don't have other reasons for doing it, which may happen, because it's plenty of situations in which it's either you go towards that risk, you take that risk, and or it's over, which can consistently happen. But in general, this is not really a good reason to do it. But he also says, interestingly enough, that and this is something he had been talking about even when explaining in the one of the previous paragraphs, the causes that lay within human nature in itself that bring us tendentially to kind of being lazy, or tending to not to exert so much effort all at once, because our nature kind of advises us to say, okay, well, slow down, let's regain resources, regain strength, and see what happens. And this other thing is essentially the inclination and the induction to estimate the power of our opponents too high than too low. So from Clausewitz, this is kind of a natural tendency that humans have in war. That is to say, okay, the enemy may be stronger than what we expected. And this is true, actually, because even when you are, so sure at one point you want to attack your enemy, and you went out there for it, you may be guided by, I don't know, certain feelings, for instance, that are of enmity and of hatred and hostility in general. Then when you're confronted with your enemy, say, wow, this may be a tougher opponent to take out than I previously thought. And that therefore is something that emerges immediately. It doesn't even emerge, in fact, on the actual assessment, the actual assessment of the enemy's strengths or capabilities, but it's still something in potential. It's like when you see your one of opponent in front of you, and you say, what is he capable of doing? How and you imagine, kind of, your brain automatically goes by instinct at kind of projecting the worst imaginable scenario at that point that can cause harm to you, because that's what you're programmed for biologically, by instinct of survival, and to say, okay, slow down, let's see what this enemy's about, and let's not go out there so quickly. So what von Clausewitz is demonstrating here is that even though definitely the lack of knowledge, the imperfect knowledge of circumstances, can also, make you more, can make you bolder fundamentally, and make you attack the enemy with more will, with more conviction. You still may, still tendentially, on average, humans tend to overestimate their opponents because of fear, fundamentally, and not to underestimate them by instinct. So this is important, because it kind of adds to this slowing down of the military operations in general by saying, okay, I find a new enemy. What do I know about them? Not much, but there is a pretty heavy risk that if I take and things go wrong, may have consequences on me. This is not just a game. You're directly involved into it. You're not playing chess. You are fundamentally doing something that can arrive to kill you, to kill your family, to destroy your country. So it's something that you can't really be so light-heartedly for. So, as you understand, this is a factor that brings to slow down action in war, tendentially. And it's conceived as a natural thing. So, von Clausewitz says, we shall admit that our imperfect insight into facts in general must contribute very much to delay action in war and to modify the application of the principles pending our conduct. So the ones that were traced initially by as the principles of war. So this is always important to remember, because von Clausewitz is never saying, you shouldn't be as direct as possible, you shouldn't immediately try to knock the enemy out. That is something that you should do. But in reality, this principle is modified in its application because of all the circumstances that can happen. And this is just one of them. There are others, as we have seen. The gap that exists in the different potential distance between attack and defense, the control of politics over the military instrument. So these paragraphs are all aimed to define fundamentally on how war works for real. That is all what von Clausewitz is interested in when it comes, in fact, to make this work a useful tool, also theoretically, to win a war. So not actually denying the principles of war as he has defined them, actually very simply, very clearly. But always bearing in mind that there is always this double track, fundamentally, of the theoretical principle and the practical application that that can never be eliminated, even by, in fact, in the assessment of your forces, of the ones of the enemy, and how they are applied for real. And this is all what war is about at this point, aside from the especially at the decisional level. Because this, by the way, informs the same combat. This is also very important. It's not simply something that slows down as long as the commander fears that the army will be annihilated. The army will actually stop itself. That's why also paradoxically, when he says, that the imperfect knowledge of circumstances could bring to actually a delay into the, for instance, into the decrease in the advance, a delay of the end of the attack, so that you go you attack without any fear. Let's say, it may be that at the end you may find an obstacle that you had not foreseen, and that you will be obliged to slow down, even in a kind of a worse way that you could imagine, because you're not being prepared for it, so that you may even lose great part of that apparent advantage that you had gained, and maybe even paying the interest for it. He comments, von Clausewitz comments, the possibility of a standstill brings into the action of war a new modification, inasmuch as it dilutes that action with the element of time, checks the influence or sense of danger in its course, and increases the means of reinstating a lost balance of force. So here von Clausewitz explains why this happens. There are reasonable motives for this standstill into that modify the action of war. First of all, by itself, the imperfect knowledge of circumstances dilutes action with the element of time. So necessarily, this lack of in reconnaissance and intelligence in what is going on out there automatically brings you by nature to slow down. So to be cautious, to invest, by the way, resources even into the acknowledgement of what is going on. So by itself, it's a kind of a constantly consuming factor, even in the physics of the process. Secondly, it checks, in fact, the influence or sense of danger in its course. So there is, in fact, this capability of, spotting danger, or being able to foretell, to calculate its probability. So this adds also to the decisional process, in the sense that it happens also during the same, that sometimes an action of reconnaissance is carried out, in fact, exactly to find out what is going on. And that is important because it dictates eventually what you do. At least if you're lucky, it could also overwhelm you without you being able to cope with it. And ultimately, these three elements are kind of intertwined in many ways. They're not actually distinct. It says it increases the means of reinstating a lost balance of force. So the ultimate goal of such a standstill is to theoretically, or at least hopefully for you, to reinstate a lost balance of force. So fundamentally, you are looking for a better situation, or at least the options that can bring to that favorable situation to be reinstated. So there is a kind of always a reciprocal action into the process, because as we have seen, and this will be much clearer from the following phrase, is that he who has the better knowledge of the situation kind of tends to lean on that and saying, okay, well, we know what it's this about, and let's go for it. There are kind of low risks because we know most of what the situation is, so it's fine. And therefore it's kind of more easygoing. It's kind of more relaxed in many ways. He who is from the other side instead is freaking out, but this freaking out instinctively brings to fasten to give definitely a more powerful motive to sort out what the best option is. That the guy that is not under pressure, or that is at least under less pressure, is not finding out pretty much. So this also has to do with the power of the motives of war. We will see it now in the next phrase, which is beautiful and also makes you understand a lot about war in itself. So that the guy from the other side, it maybe knows less, but in its own fields of options, is kind of thinking faster, and therefore can strike back the enemy with kind of a greater impact. And at that point, it's as if these two forces altogether, considered as in just a comprehensive system, were kind of re-equilibrating each other by what? By instinct, fundamentally. Because in here it's human nature that is fundamentally either relaxing or contracting, let's say, in order to achieve something. And this tendentially goes by instinct, as von Clausewitz pointed out. So you can have a general who knows best, who makes the perfect decision, etc., which doesn't exist, of course, and that therefore increases this even intellectual, let's say, injects this intellectual resources and wisdom into the military action, and kind of makes it quicker, even in terms of time, so that standstills are brought to a to a minimum. But yet tendentially, not just him, but actually the whole military machine tends to get in fact compressed and decompressed in terms of pressure, and therefore to cause a more or less let's say to have a more or less powerful reaction to the situation. And also in this sense generally a quicker or slower one. And here von Clausewitz explains it beautifully in the last phrase. He says, in fact, the greater the tension of feelings from which the war springs, the greater therefore the energy with which it's carried on, so much the shorter will be the periods of inaction. On the other hand, the weaker the principle of warlike activity, the longer will be these periods, for powerful motives increase the force of the will, and this, as we know, is always a factor in the product of force. This is very, very important, because the product of force is always given by the power of the motives. And therefore you can have the greatest strength in the world, but if you don't have enough a satisfying motivation, you cannot achieve much. Satisfactory motive, you may remain there without doing anything. So here, by the way, reinforces naturally the Clausewitzian a principle that, in fact, it's the motive that brings the military instrument into action from politics, that dictates, in fact, the energy with which the action of war is carried on, and it tells you that there can't be that force alone is fundamentally not it's not enough to win. So you may find actually a much weaker foe that, however, is very much more motivated than you, and this is not a precondition for winning for him, but it's still something that creates fundamentally they can't put up a greater energy than what you may do with greater strengths but with lesser motives. So in fact this is very simple. It's like, you understand how Clausewitzian dialectics is so mathematical in many ways. Here there is a principle of relation. It's like an equation fundamentally. There is a variable and the thing can be even theoretically measured. Of course, von Clausewitz is against any kind of scientific measurement of war, because there is not such a thing, as war is not the one of military art is not, in fact, it's not a science, but in fact an art proper. However, these inherent relations are always there. I mean, they function, but the problem with them is that in every war they function in a different way. Or better, the principle functions always in the same way, but the variables change continuously. And the worst is that they change actually in every war. So you see how this gets overly complicated, in fact, and how there can't be realistically any scientific approach to the conduct of war, and how this, let's say, these relations, these dynamics have to be measured chiefly through experience and through, this kind of wisdom that you can acquire through through the actual command of the through actual military experience and through this study of military history of war, actually. The history of war for what it's been for real. And remember that von Clausewitz wrote the Vom Krige also with this polemical intent against those who instead were at the time trying to optimistically, positivistically spot fundamentally some principles that could arrive to measure war, physically speaking. The concept of internal lines that you can, as if in war all it took could be a manual to read in order to achieve victory, or at least to make the best choice ever. And this is something that effectively crumbled as an opinion, and this is why von Clausewitz is at this point the still and probably will always remain the unchallenged military theorist, that say the most influential military theorist in also all the, not just in broad philosophy, but also in the way the modern military all around the world is built on. The military around the world is based today on Clausewitzian principles. There are no others. And so this is not really a guy, but there are people actually who believe that this is a guy who wrote something weird in the 19th century. Nobody cares. This is literally how our military is created. It is based upon, theoretically speaking. Still, even though there are this kind of people who, I don't know, think they know better, that there is kind of a different interpretation of war, etc., but still, military history all over the world and all over history reconfirms every single thing that von Clausewitz said. And not because he foresaw that, he was like Nostradamus or something like that. He actually was explaining how the thing actually works. Because we know how it actually works. I mean, he knew it naturally by his military experience as a Prussian general, with being through all the had rising from the ranks throughout all the Napoleonic wars, but he also was a military historian, and he's telling you, look, if you combine the two things, it's not really a matter of opinion about what war is or how it works. This is particularly important from an intellectual point of view, because von Clausewitz, as we have seen in the introduction we made before reading the Vom Krige, he was a relatively he was a fundamentally modest person, actually, and he was saying, it's not even about me here at this point, because he knew he would have died before his work had been completed. But he also hoped that someone else could come to basically refine this thinking that was not his thinking, but essentially as the right interpretation of how war is for real. I mean, the right description, not even interpretation. This is like a problem to solve. And so when approaching von Clausewitz, never think that he is doing this for his own, merit as a thinker, as a theorist, etc. He is telling you, look, I am someone who understands a bit of how these things work. This is how you should be supposed to deal with war in the first place, because this is important to remember. The Vom Krige is a book conceived in order to theoretically also being able to fight a war, paradoxically. I mean, von Clausewitz was anti-system in this sense, let's say, positivist. I don't know whether it's the right, the definition for von Clausewitz, because positivism, in part, was developed at least at its full potential, kind of later. a few decades after von Clausewitz's death, but this kind of progressivistic thought was already there in the, not just in the end of the 18th century, but also and especially in the first half of the 19th. And von Clausewitz is still actual today, exactly because of this reason, because it's not a matter of actuality based on a relative contingency. Von Clausewitz doesn't describe 19th century warfare. He describes warfare as it is, old times. This is also to remember at all times. Von Clausewitz wasn't writing about the Napoleonic Wars. He studied all military history, actually. He was describing warfare in its essentials. And that's it. That's why what we're talking about now is not... He makes plenty of examples drawn from history, not just from the Napoleonic Wars, and naturally had been kind of the biggest thing ever happened in military history up to that time in human civilization. So that is justified, but he makes constant examples from the past, from not just also from the 18th century, but also from Roman times and other periods, etc., where from which he draws this constant. So those are just examples that have to be applied, and that's why von Clausewitz is also so useful for every military historian, because it's as if he already told you how certain things have to be regarded as usual. I mean, it's not that you can apply von Clausewitz by, as a problem solver for historical interpretations. He's the first one that says that, as a historian, you don't have the certainty about the relation cause-consequence. You can't basically judge you can't get to a solution. You should be intellectually honest enough about it, but still, if after you have especially been studying a period in history, in the history of warfare, and you studied kind of tens, if not hundreds of battles and so on, and you started to understand more or less how things worked at the time, well, you realize that the whole system in fact follows always the Clausewitzian description of war. This is embarrassingly functioning. And that's the beauty, and that's why you have to love this man, because come on, I mean, it's this is not a matter of opinion. We live in a world where the opinion is fundamentally, just because you breathe, your opinion must be of some value. This is not how it works. There are you should always be free to express your opinion, but this doesn't mean that your opinion is valuable by itself. Your opinion is valuable only if it is closer to truth, let's say. Let's use this approximation. If it has some substance, some evidence to back it, some scientific evidence at the end of the day, and therefore, I think we have lost in many ways this ability to objectivize. This is one of the greatest problems. So when you read thinkers like, especially from the 18th to the 19th century, you realize that they were quite solidly grounded in their thinking. Not all of them, of course, but let's say these thinkers emerged from a world that also was used to reason in a very different manner than we did. I mean, today we go into theoretical thinking by default, because we have kind of abandoned practical thinking. These thinkers here emerged from a world I was thinking 90%, if not more, into practical terms. So this is why this theoretical thinking at the time was so valuable, because it was considered at the time to be fact checkable, which is something that today we seem not to be interested at all in any way. And it's embarrassing because now we have, theoretically, the intellectual skills to absorb the systems relatively easily. And therefore to confrontate our minds with some of of the greatest thinkers of Western civilization, as well as others, of course, but especially talking about these great thinkers of the time. Well, why don't we do it? Why do we have to indulge into the idea that somehow what we say is important because it's us that are saying it? It doesn't work. We should start to reason in ways that function, that never lose track, never lose contact with reality. And von Clausewitz is one of the best examples of this, because when you go to study history, his interpretation works. And it works because it's really grounded on the experience of a guy who fought literally throughout all the wars of coalitions, that studied tens of campaigns as a military historian. I studied in my life, I think, just thoroughly, I mean seriously, with all the sources, in everything proper and everything, like one campaign only, and it took me 1 year. And that was a campaign from the 13th century. This is a guy who studied tens of them in his life, and even from much more recent times that had plenty of sources. So that's not really someone you can top, really, on average. So that's definitely a good measure that, say, over which to model your action, because or to adapt your action to evaluate your action. Sorry, but this concept is crystalline clear. The greater there is a tension of feelings, from which the war springs, because always remember, it's always about that. The greater, therefore, the energy with which it's carried on, so much the shorter will be the periods of inaction. This is something you can relate in everyday life. It's like when you have, I don't know, you have homework, and you say, oh my god, it's so much, I'm so anxious because there is gonna be an examination soon, and I must really do this homework, man, it's otherwise I get a bad mark, and so on. So you're under pressure. You have a motive. It's something that makes you going on. In this sense, difficulties keep us alive. I consistently believe that civilization doesn't stem from positive progress, from kind of putting patches on our human misery in many ways, which is still something prodigious in the outcome. But this is where it starts from, because when you're pressured, you kind of give the best of yourself. Then when everything grows smoother, like, let's say maybe you manage to do that homework, or maybe you don't, but the examination passes and you are not the guy who was being picked in the class to be examined. You relax, and then when you relax, you say, "Whew, finally I can relax." And what happens is that you say, okay, well, I will relax, but I have to keep myself fit for next time, because this can't happen at any time soon. But for now, let's just spend this time, like, other 10 minutes of video gaming, okay, maybe like another half an hour, okay, maybe 1 hour, then you maybe spend the whole afternoon playing, and you don't do anything. So at that point, that's where you over-relax. So where you, in fact, lose more time. This is what von Clausewitz is telling to you. Here the period of inaction increases. So you get slower, and you achieve less. On the other hand, he says, the weaker the principle of warlike activity... okay, we had already said actually the reverse, but you understand, this is the same exact concept reverse. The weaker the principle of warlike activity, the longer will be these periods. So instead, when you're pressured, the action is much more intense, and you go much faster. And it's probably embarrassing to see how much time you waste by standard, even in conditions of normal, let's say, of mental health, fundamentally, because you know, that we live in a moment where in history where things like psychological illnesses are kind of more frequent, or at least we are more pressured mentally than physically, let's say, and therefore we kind of give up mentally. Okay, but it's embarrassing how I believe in general we are relaxing as a civilization, and this happens. You know why? Because we're better off, we're richer. We've never been so well like now in history. So this is the reason why you say, okay, well, I got more or less everything I want. What do I do with what I have? Play video games. Stay here. Don't do anything. I have like the whole knowledge accessible for free, a click away from me, and I don't care, because I don't care that for millennia people have struggled to get an education, to get knowledge. I don't give a damn about knowledge, and this is what's going on, and that's why there is that detachment from reality I was talking to you about before. Because, you know, if you're not pressured by serious problems, fundamentally you can also invent other problems. That's why politics is getting kind of a circus more than it was in the past. I mean, violence. Politics has always been kind of a dirty business and all, but you know, look at what we are kind of, let's say, fighting for today, and what we were fighting for like 100 years ago, or even less, like 70 years ago. And you will realize that most of the problems we pose ourselves today are actually insignificant, especially at the political level, and how important, and especially at least how much importance we attribute to it, because it's normal. You know, if things get better, you know, you can also start caring about, you know, less important things, arguably politically, like good. You know, we don't have to be concerned about extremely serious problems, although there are still today. Some of them are also quite of a problem, actually. And the problem also comes from the imperfect knowledge of reality. So von Clausewitz would have been very sympathetic for it. But what is really messed up is the importance we give to problems that are minimal, and how this tend to cover also the most important ones. Or there are great problems that are also misinterpreted, so that it's not really that there is not that problem, but people present it in a way that kind of maybe leans towards a direction that is evenly politically, you know, for profit oriented, for instance. And therefore, from the other side, people, instead of caring about the actual problem that does exist, cares now about the political switch, but nobody, the interests of the other political side, but doesn't address the problem the way it is. So this is a bit what you can draw from human nature that also von Clausewitz is noticing in here. In war, it is a different thing, but war is fundamentally struggling against some odds, right? To oversimplify. Well, so this happens in every condition of our life. We're always in a kind of conflict with something, also with ourselves. Telling the truth, chiefly with ourselves, because in fact this problem lays within ourselves. It lays within our nature. The way this the idea of procrastinating, of saying, okay, well, I'm not under particular pressure, so I don't give a damn about doing better. And this is serious because it slows down, it dilutes the action over time. So this also brings to a stagnation of progress in many ways. Just think, I mean, out there in the world, if only every single person in the world did, I'm not saying, 1 hour work more in a day for real, concentrating, but just like 5 minutes, I think economy would rise, would be much stronger, much greater, and we heavily underestimate the effect of such things. So actually nothing is really so difficult as it seems most of the times. The problem is that we may actually not realize it, and that's our greatest problem, arguably. It's a problem of acknowledgement. And at all times, because ultimately we function with our brain that processes these informations. We're not machines, and everything comes from there. So it's about motives. It's about motives. Strength can be built over time. Motives have to be kept alive, have to be understood. They derive from knowledge, in fact. So, and as von Clausewitz says in here, for powerful motives increase the force of will, and this, as we know, is always a factor in the product of force. So this is more or less what I wanted to talk to you about today. And you realize that this is potentially, you could write entire PhDs on topics like this. And it would be interesting to orient research towards these directions, because probably this will become the most important problems for in our society in a very few decades. Today we still don't want to acknowledge it, because we are transitioning. We are still pretty much we have to adapt our mind in many ways to this, but also, in fact, our awareness of the situation. But we will be forced into this, and my fear is that it will happen ruinously, so that like this what von Clausewitz was talking about not just the slowing down because you fear about the unknown, but that you keep going on because you objectively don't know how screwed you are already, but you keep doing whatever you want to you thought it was right to do before, and while now it has completely changed. So that before you realize it's gone wrong, well, you may do consistent damage to yourself, to the others, and this is happening already, actually, and in many ways, in many fields, and this is dramatic because it's actually not something new, and it explains a little bit the conditions of human nature. I mean, on how we struggle with reality. I think the majority of our problems do not actually come from material problem solving, but actually about the misunderstanding with other people, either also the misunderstandings misunderstanding of ourselves, which is definitely probably the most greatest problem at this point at every human's in every human's life in some ways. But whatever, now I'm getting philosophical and boring as usual, more than usual at least, so I will cut it short. So as always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.